So good morning, everybody. It's dead on 11 o'clock. We've got a whole bunch of people on the call already. So we're going to start off. First off, thank you very much for taking the time out of your diaries this morning to talk about something which, let's be honest, has probably been rammed down all of our throats for the past few months. And that subject is, how we go and secure our remote workers. So you're probably aware, ANSecurity, we're not aligned to any specific vendor. So just like you guys, we are continually bombarded all the time from vendors promising silver bullet solutions. Every single one of them is going to immediately solve all of our remote working issues, make everybody 10 minutes more productive every hour, improve our security posture overnight, change climate change, make climate change go away. You name it, they're going to do it. And that's not really particularly helpful. It just leads to noise. And that's a real problem for us because we continually talk to you, our customers, about what's important to you. And it's no surprise at all at the moment that secure remote working is something that you consistently and quite rightly worry about, hence the request for this session. And one of the issues that you have is understanding from the vendor community what things we should look at, what things we should be worried about, and what the solutions are. Now, what we're aiming to deliver today is a totally sales pitch free summary of the sorts of things that you need to consider doing in order to ensure that you stay one step ahead of the threat actors. So, who have we got on the panel today? I'm the guy on the left. My name's Richard Page, and I'm one of the directors here at ANSecurity. And one of the hats that I wear here is looking after vendor relations. So, I spend half of my day answering calls, reading emails, and I've been doing this for the best part of 25 years. So for want of a more polite phrase, I've generated a pretty decent nonsense filter when it comes to vendor claims. So if there's anything that you want to run by me, if it sounds too good to be true, then please just let me know. But the real star of the show we've got here, James Preston. Many of you will have already worked with him previously. James, I'm going to be quite lazy and just ask you to introduce yourself, if that's okay.
No problem. Thank you very much, Rich. So I'm James Preston. I've been with ANSecurity the better part of 2 years now. And during that time, I've had a real focus on the Cyber Essentials program from the National Cyber Security Centre, along with deploying security technologies to protect organisations from threats on the internet and also those threats that might make it inside their network. Thank you very much, Rich.
Excellent. Thanks, James. So the typical way that we do this at ANSecurity, we ask you what you want us to cover. We go and collate the content and hope that we hit the mark. So, COVID, still the story of the day. It's going to remain so for the foreseeable future. And the rules that govern who can work in an old school office environment and who can't, changes daily, almost hourly. But in terms of what the guidance is on what the future will look like in terms of remote working, it seems to be pretty consistent if we go and look at what the analysts have to say. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick look as to what's happening in the here and now, but also have a look about what the future might look like when it comes to remote working. I'll then hand over to James, and he's going to take you through some really nice work that he's put together, a really simple checklist, which we've developed to help you do some introspective analysis, asking yourself the questions you absolutely must ask if you want to stay one step ahead of these threat actors. And then James has got some useful advice around solutions that you may want to consider if you've got certain remote working problems, and also some simple process changes and things that you can do. But we know that times are tough here. We've done our best to sort of cut through the nonsense from the vendor community to go and try and find some takeaways that you can action, but we focused it on doing stuff that costs you absolutely nothing. So hopefully there'll be some useful stuff that you can take away from this. And if we've not waffled on too much at the end, we should have some time for questions. And we've basically got two approaches to questions. If you want to send a question and you want it to be anonymous, you can just email it to me. My email address is rpage@ansecurity.com. I'm going to be monitoring this inbox throughout the session. Or alternatively, if you're happy for everybody to see it, then just drop your question into the Zoom console. Now, I sat through, like we all have, hundreds of online meetings over the last couple of months, some good, some atrocious, but generally the frequency in which I get value from the Q&A session increases all the time. There's no such thing as a bad or silly question. So if you want to ask anything, just fire away. We want to make sure that your investment in this time is worthwhile today. So let's crack on. Let's go and have a look at what's been going on in the world and what the future might look like when it comes to remote working. Now, I don't know about you, but it sort of feels like, we're destined to be all working from home forevermore. And if you kind of look at the statistics, they just sort of support this view. Now, in terms of remote working records, they started in the early 2000s when, the internet really started to be a thing in our business life. And every year there's been a gradual year-on-year increase in the UK users who choose to work from home and are also able to work from home. However, the pandemic hit, and then we moved on multiple decades in terms of that year-on-year growth, literally overnight. So March the 23rd, Boris stood up, he made his announcement, and we all had to act. And the ONS suggests that in April, 46.6% of the total UK workforce work from home. And that's the total UK workforce. So it includes people that don't have the capability to even work from home, as their role would never demand it. And of that total UK workforce, 86% did so directly as a result of the pandemic. But that doesn't necessarily suggest that this is what the future is going to look like in any way, shape or form. But if you look at bits of evidence, you can see that this is unlikely to be a trend. This is going to continue. And the key one that I think is that the majority of people really seem to like this new work-life balance. Really, if you go and walk into the street and ask somebody about whether they enjoy any of the restrictions that have been put on their daily lifestyle, they're going to say no. However, the ability to work from home is seen as one of those only real benefits that comes from the pandemic. Workers, they feel that they're more productive when they're working from home, and in many senses they are. And there's two ways in which you can view that. The first one is looking very positively. I can deliver much better results working from home in my 7.5-hour day. Or the other view is I can handle the same volume of work in just a shorter space of time, and I can then get back on to enjoy my life with my family. Whichever way you calculate it or look at it, clearly, if there was such a thing as a home working productivity quotient, it's definitely on the up. And that leads us to the next point, work-related stress. It seems to be far less prevalent in those who work from home as opposed to when they were working in the office. Now, I don't pretend that this is a blanket statement that affects everybody. We know that some people really thrive on one-to-one contact, but it's definitely a trend for the vast majority. And I think this plays nicely into this third point here, is that, and I've got to admit that I noticed a marginal difference myself until I got a bill for teenagers' braces, but remote workers are basically financially better off. 30% are as much as, well, between 330 and 350 of net income each month. That's about £4 a year. So you can start to see why people are slightly less stressed, because they've got more disposable income, if they're one of the lucky ones that have still got jobs. Now, something that's not made it onto the slides, I just heard it this morning, but I really wanted to bring it up, and I'm paraphrasing a few numbers here, but I think it really hits home. 74% of the workers, 74, 75, something like that, 74% of workers in this country would absolutely consider changing jobs in order to continue working remotely. That's the question that was asked now in our COVID world. That same question 12 months ago, when looking at remote working, 65% looked to change jobs if they would have been forced to work from home. So that's almost like a diametrically opposed view in 12 months. We've given the option of staff to go and work from home. They've liked it, and therefore they want to do more of it. But, let's not be naive here. What the employee thinks is important, but it's almost less important than what the company thinks. But that's the interesting thing, is because when it comes to really important metrics, and we're talking things like productivity, performance, absenteeism, staff retention, I won't go through all the numbers here, you can see them on the screen here, but all of those metrics are pointing in the right direction. Staff are more productive, quality of output is higher, absenteeism is lower, and job retention of key workers has also improved as well. And all of that translates to the really important stuff, when you're looking at the boardroom, bottom line savings. On average, you're looking at around about £8,500 per telecommuter saving per year. And the only thing that's bad about that is that awful term telecommuter. I'm just hoping that's something that doesn't stick, but I fear it might. So when it comes to remote working, clearly technology is massively important. It's massively important to all of us on the call because, you know, that's how we earn our livings. But, you know, take us all the way back to March. Pretty much overnight, we had to go and think of really clever ways of getting our staff out of the office, making them productive pretty much at the drop of a hat. So if you then go and put yourself back 6 months ago, you know, what were people spending their budgets on? Now, clearly number one is web conferencing. You can see that at 67% here. And that makes absolute sense. You know, we are taking away that face-to-face contact. We need to go and replace it with something like video conferencing. And, you know, I'm going to hold my hands up and say naively in March, I've been working in IT forever. I'd never heard of Zoom. I think if you'd have asked the man in the street, if they were born before 1985, they'd probably sort of say it was an ice lolly. I mean, it's taken over the world. It's taken over our lives. But it's important. You need to give that face-to-face contact so we can understand that. And web conferencing is closely followed by collaboration tools and also remote desktop tools. But security was pretty low down on the list, which I was quite surprised about. But I think this is generally within the IT community, it's a sentiment that is probably shared. I think everybody's surprised. You know, obviously it's essential that we give our staff the tools to be able to perform their job roles. But it's also essential that those tools that we provide them with are secure. And 84% of IT professionals, you know, they see that remote workers are a greater security risk. But are they right? You know, we don't necessarily know everything within the IT community. Is the working environment of any greater threat now than we were this time last year? Well, you know, we've seen drastic changes as a society, how we work and play as a result of the pandemic. And there's going to be lots of guess whats. You know, guess what? The threat actors, they've taken notice and they have gone and exploited the situation, as they do. And it's the absolute perfect storm for the determined threat actor. You know, if you think about behavior and what goes on within a corporate environment, whether you're a small business or a large business, something like cybersecurity is of significantly less interest and importance when, quote unquote, there are other things to worry about. You know, within the pandemic, we've got to worry about, you know, where the revenue of an organization is coming from, how we can go and pay our staff, our cash flow, changing propositions, all of this sort of stuff, which starts to move things like cybersecurity further down the list. And the threat actors know that. And almost instantaneously overnight, the attacks started to increase significantly. So even before the crisis had hit European shores, before we had that first case, the World Health Organization, they reported an increase of around about 500% in cybersecurity incidents. But, you know, that is absolutely nothing when you look at what's going on in the UK, and this is a consistent picture across the world. You know, if you just look at the UK SOC at CGI, they reported a 30,000% increase in cyber threats when measured over the same period in 2019. Now, that's not a typo. It's an incredibly insane number, 30,000% increase. But where are these threats coming from? You know, where do we need to be concerned about? Well, let's have a look at insider threats. It's going to come as absolutely no surprise that there's a significant increase in the volume and complexity of insider threats. And if you apply some basic behavioral principles, you can understand why. Now, typically, 80% of what is referred to as a flight risk employee starts to take data with them anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months before they leave their job. Now, when you've got the increasing concern over job security, people continually looking over their shoulder, staff are doing what you would expect them to do. They're starting to think about number one, and they're getting themselves ready and prepared for how they might be able to hit the ground running in a new role in the future. So yes, we've got gains in terms of improvement of the quality of output, but there's a lot of risks that are related to COVID-19 that we need to consider. And the risk of insider data theft is something which affects absolutely every single organization. Malware, you can't talk about cybersecurity without touching about malware, and obviously there's been a significant increase in all shapes and forms. But one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly was mobile device applications, using applications connected with words connected to the pandemic. So things like Corona safety mask, or there's one that was this week, Manchester local lockdown. These apps typically grant the threat actor with full internet access on the devices that allow the app to do everything, create network sockets, read contact data from the victim's devices, send SMS messages, it's pretty much full control. And, if you really look into the, what's written within the cyber community, it used to be that never a week went by without the launch of another mobile app threat. At the moment, it's a daily thing. The phishing emails, phishing is always going to be a problem, always has been. It's always going to be the significant threat vector that we need to be concerned about. Threat actors are investing even more money, greater time, greater resource, greater ingenuity in some instances. Sometimes it's like Ocean's 11 in terms of the complexity of the attacks they're putting together. They're multi-touch. They're really difficult to sort of see what is a genuine looking email and what's not. And there's loads of information and statistics which talk about phishing, but the one that really strikes me just relates to something as simple as Gmail. On a daily basis, Google blocks an average of 18 million COVID-related emails just on its Gmail platform. And that's not one email sent 18 million times. That's 18 million individual emails. And those are just the ones that they block on a single platform. This is a significant problem. Let's have a look at weaponized websites briefly. It's a consistent picture here. So since May, there's been 600,000 COVID-19 related web domains that have been registered. And the frightening fact here is that 125,000 of those are malicious. You've got no idea what's safe to click on anymore. And clearly, if there was the equivalent of a cybersecurity R number when it came to websites, we'd be in a permanent state of semi-lockdown forevermore. But what about new things? We say it's new, but it's been an emerging problem that we at ANSecurity we've been looking at for a while, and we're talking about video conferencing. We call it Zoom bombing because it sounds cool, but it's applicable to all of the video conferencing applications. We've had this massive, essential meteoric rise in the popularity of video conferencing, but it's just not been met with the same meteoric increase in companies who seriously consider how to secure the application. And and guess what? The threat actors, they're aware of that, and it's no surprise at all. And you can Google this, and there's lots of articles about it. There's lots of UK financial institutions, legal firms, and even parts of the public sector that put a blanket ban on the use of applications like this for external users. So what? That's a question we often get asked. So what if we get breached? If we get breached, we get breached. We'll deal with it. And it's a perfectly legitimate and understandable perspective to have. However, we're a bunch of IT professionals. If we were a bunch of accountants or financial controllers, we'd look at the facts, we'd look at the evidence, and we'd make a business case. And if we do that, every organisation in the land would do something about it. Now, I think there's loads of information that's out there. A lot of it is fictitious. The one thing that we really, really like and we really respect is a report from last year, so it's pre-COVID, from the Ponemon Institute, and it's entitled Cost of a Data Breach. It's absolutely free to download. It's really worth a read. There's loads of useful stuff that you can use for any investment case you might want to put forward. Although I do stress the numbers that we talk about here, they're just related around the cost of data breaches. There's loads of other kinds of data breach, but I think it gives you a good directionally correct number to be able to work from. So shockingly, and it's a dollar value, but the average cost of a data breach was $3.92 million. And this is, as I said, it's pre-COVID, it's pre the age of the remote worker. And there's lots of guesstimates at the moment as to what that 2020 value would be. But we at ANSecurity, we put our neck on the block and say, actually, this $3.92 million, around about 3 million quid, is actually probably a pretty good guide as to what a breach would cost. Now you can see here on the screen how that 3 million sterling is broken down, you know, that's a massive impact on the bottom line of any business. I'm not going to go into detail on all of this. It's all within the report. But, you know, breaches affect every single business. It's typically around about the same value if you're a small organization or if you're a global enterprise. It changes a little bit, but obviously the smaller the organization, the more impact and the greater the cost per head and the disruption to the businesses. So, yeah, it affects every business of every size in pretty much every industry and geographical location throughout the world. But our response to those cyber threat actors needs to be targeted to be specific to how you guys perceive the risk. And that's the thing that's really important to us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to James so he can go and start to teach you some things that you can be doing in terms of introspective analysis to make sure that you understand what your risk is. So questions that you as a business really must ask yourself. So what I'm going to do now is very slickly just stop sharing. And James, if you want to take over.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rich. So when it comes to deciding these 10 questions that we're going to be asking ourselves over the next couple of minutes, what I've done is linked that into what we call the cyber attack lifecycle. So this is a process that any threat actor has to go through to actually achieve whatever their objective is. And that might be the simple nature of stealing data, encrypting data, or perhaps just destroying the reputation of an organization or a company. Now, this is a multi-step process for the threat actors. So they have to conduct reconnaissance against their target. They have to find some way into that organization, come up with the correct weapon, and have the methods to actually deliver that weapon to the organization, which usually leads to some form of an exploit. And once they've actually delivered that exploit, they need to bring in new tools which can actually enable them to achieve their actions on objective. And usually that also includes an element of delivering persistence into that environment, such that if they are detected, there's some other way for them to make it back inside. And usually that has a method of command and control as well. So client computers reaching out to a known malicious website, perhaps, to receive the instructions on what they need to do to carry out that malicious action. Now, the brilliant thing for us as the defenders is we only actually have to win once in this step to defeat that threat actor. If we can block them at the reconnaissance phase, and every single other point from there on in is now null and void, the threat actor has to perform a new set of reconnaissance activities to be able to get into your network. Or equally so, if we do detect them, detect their method of command and control, and then cut that off as an avenue, we can prevent them from delivering their actions on objectives, be that stealing data, encrypting data, or perhaps just destroying reputation. So, looking at those 10 questions, starting out, are you only allowing access from the geographies that your organization is actively working in? And this can be a simple case of, if you're using a firewall-based VPN appliance, to setting the allow rule to only having those geographies, be it the United Kingdom, perhaps Ireland, perhaps the United States if you have partners over there. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, this is going to be easily defeated. It's a simple case for the threat actors to hop into a VPN in the United Kingdom or one of those other geographical areas, and they can bypass this very simple but still effective control measure. Now, if you have a look at the graph at the bottom right-hand corner there, this is information that we've taken from one of our honeypots over the last couple of days of the number of probes, the number of attempted exploits that were seen from a variety of countries. Now, quite surprising to us, but they do pop up every now and again. On the blue bar on the far left-hand side there, that's actually the Netherlands. So we're seeing a significant quantity of probes against our honeypot infrastructure from the Netherlands. After that, we have the usual suspects. So Russia, the United States, which sometimes surprises people. Unfortunately, that's quite often computers that have just simply been compromised and are perhaps being used in a botnet. And then, of course, other countries like China, Lithuania, Ukraine seems to pop up every now and again. It's almost like there's something strange and interesting happening over there. So the reality is all these detections from these various countries, which we might not necessarily have a legitimate purpose to be operating in, can very simply be blocked through the application of that firewall rule. And although the threat actors have ways to get around that with VPNs and such like, it can cut off those who are the casual attackers, those who are just going after the low-hanging fruit. And you can apply the same protections around identity as well. So if you're using something, for example, like Azure AD or an Okta instance, you can also use that to only allow logins from trusted countries, trusted IP address ranges. So the second question to answer yourself there is, are your users aware of phishing and other account compromises? So the reality is phishing is still absolutely rife out there. There are a lot of organizations who are being targeted through either spear phishing, where someone is going after perhaps someone in the financial organizations and looking to encourage them to transfer large sums of money to offshore accounts, or perhaps just those threat actors that are looking to get hold of credentials. Now, a lot of these attacks can be very simply stopped by just some basic education to your users, ensuring that they are aware that phishing is a thing and that they need to be looking out for those obvious indicators. Now, the SANS organization publishes a Ouch newsletter on a regular basis, and they've covered phishing a couple of times through that. So certainly you can use their newsletters, their videos, their training as a free resource, which you can publish to your users to help educate them if you're not already using something like a dedicated phish simulation platform. Now, one bit which might surprise some people is you can also use URL filtering to help overcome some of these phishing attacks. A lot of these phishing domains will make it onto lists of known malicious websites, and a lot of those lists are then published out to the internet. OpenFish being an absolute brilliant resource of domains and website addresses which have been seen actively engaging in phishing campaigns. And by importing those lists into your firewalls, into your web filtering appliances, you can cut off those types of attack very quickly, blocking the ability for threat actors to perhaps discover and exploit vulnerabilities in your networks relating to the user element, relating to the human elements, which are, without training, very easy to exploit, of course. So next up, question number 3 is, have you unified your identity services under one single provider? And furthermore, is that identity appropriately secured? So for the longest time and before the adoption of services like SAML, we were seeing a lot of organizations having multiple login services. And what we're looking to do now is bring all those login services under one single banner. Now, MFA, of course, very quickly becomes apparent in this notion of identity protection. So Microsoft cites and has done on a number of occasions now that 99.9% of identity-based attacks can be prevented using some form of multi-factor authentication. But it's important to understand that when you're using multi-factor authentication, you need to scale the response to the risk. So those users who might have low privileged access to company data, this is where we want to be looking at using the traditional TOTP keys, or perhaps a push notification or a text message. Whereas those users who have access to highly sensitive, highly privileged information, and indeed the IT administrators, it's worth considering, can we use some form of a hardware key, some form of an encryption method, an identification method, which requires you to physically interact with the machine to actually allow you in. And this is because we've seen a couple of instances now where users have actually been phished asking for these MFA tokens, where the threat actor has literally called up the user and asked them to accept the prompt which has just appeared on their mobile phone. And that by only using these hardware keys, ensuring that only the user who is actively at that machine, can we actually guarantee protections for these users who might be vulnerable to this type of phishing. And of course, it provides an added level of security and identity protection for IT administrators as well. So there in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got the YubiKey security key, which can provide these methods of hardware-based identification. Of course, plenty of other options out there as well. We've had a couple of organizations reach out to us recently as well, asking about security certificates. In particular, are machine-based security certificates, when presented to their VPNs, a valid method of securing the identity? And entirely yes, security certificates can indeed in some situations be seen as greater than the protections provided by MFA. But it's important to consider a couple of aspects there. So in particular, that when the security certificates are issued, that method of identifying the machine and issuing that certificate, the control channel for that is indeed appropriately secured. And that also once that certificate makes it onto the machine, that security certificate is protected in hardware, perhaps using the trusted platform module and BitLocker drive encryption to ensure that security certificate can't be extracted from the machine. And finally, that if a certificate is seen to be breached in some manner, that you have an effective method to revoke that security certificate to prevent it being used for computer logins. Now, by using these strong identity protections, we can very quickly cut off the reconnaissance phases. So making it show that the threat actors can't even see what services they're trying to breach into. And of course, it helps us delay or entirely stop the ability for the threat actors to actually deliver some kind of a malicious payload into your environments. So our next question, and you've probably had this one screamed and shouted at you over the last couple of years now, but the true reality is that a lot of organizations just aren't keeping up with the basics, just aren't applying patches. So question number 4 for you, are you applying software updates to your remote services in a timely manner? Now, the reality is patching has never been optional. The threat actors are indeed going out there and looking for ways to exploit known vulnerabilities in services and servers, in particular recently VPN appliances. Now, I say that this needs to be timely, and by timely, I typically mean within 14 days of that patch going live. And it's important to understand that's not 14 business days, that is 14 calendar days, bearing in mind that the threat actors are going to be active at the weekends. Just because it's finished at 9 o'clock just because it's 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon doesn't mean they're all clocking off now for the weekend. Now, when it comes to ensuring that those patches are identified in a timely manner, be sure to subscribe to any of the alerts that you can receive from your software vendors. A couple of examples there. So Palo Alto Networks have an email subscription service, an RSS subscription service, the same with Pulse Secure. And of course, projects for the Apache web server and other web services that you can publish out to the internet issue their security bulletins. Now, if you can't apply a patch for whatever strange and interesting reason that might be specific to your environment, it's important that you consider a risk assessment. Look at alternatives to patching. Is there a way that we could decrypt traffic as it's reaching our services, inspect it for malicious payloads using an IPS service, and of course, block those threats? An important point to understand as well is that once you've deployed those patches, that you also have some mechanism to verify that they have actually been fully applied. In particular, with Microsoft services over the last couple of weeks and months, there's been a couple of instances where just deploying the patch isn't actually sufficient to protect you, and that a registry key change or something similar is also required to fully take advantage of that patching process. Of course, this can help block the threat actors at the exploit level. If our systems are kept patched and up to date, it's going to be much harder for the threat actor to actually be able to breach those systems. So question number 5, are you using only the strongest cryptography to protect your data in transit? So users that might be connecting to web services or perhaps an IPsec VPN. And indeed, are you decrypting and inspecting traffic before it makes it to your servers and services? So we've seen a couple of instances recently where when a VPN appliance in particular gets deployed for the first time, that the out-of-the-box configuration is massively insecure, allowing really old, really weak ciphers. And this allows the threat actors to try and exploit this situation by attempting to downgrade the user from a high level of protection and cryptography to a low level. And by capturing the data as it's traversing the internet, as it's perhaps traversing a public Wi-Fi hotspot, the threat actors can then decrypt that traffic offline, perhaps using cloud compute, or even in recent instances using commercially available graphics processors to then look for usernames and passwords to look for ways to exploit those services. Now, by only enabling the strongest ciphers, the strongest encryption suites on these services, you can cut off these types of downgrade attacks. And here, tools like Nmap and SSL Labs can really help to identify these weak methods of cryptography. Now, the National Cybersecurity Centre actually also has some specific guidance on the cipher suites to use for those people who have IPsec VPNs as well. So be sure, if you do have an IPsec VPN, to go and search out for that information from the NCSC. And if you can't find it, just get in touch with your ANSecurity representative and we'll email that link over to you. Now, by increasing this method of cryptography, it also increases the sophistication required by a threat actor. So again, we are cutting off the reconnaissance phase for those threat actors who might be very casual in nature, just looking for the low-hanging fruit. And the final step here as well is that if a lot of your traffic reaching your web services that you're publishing out to the internet, or your VPN services that you're publishing out to the internet, are encrypted in nature, as they should be, of course, these days, it's important that you provide those private keys to your edge and perimeter devices such that they can break the encryption, inspect that traffic, and see if the threat actors are attempting to hide malicious payloads inside that encrypted traffic. So question number 6 for you: when connected, do your standard users have the same access levels as IT administrators? So this brings us into the notion of least privilege. Now, back in March, a heck of a lot of my time was actually being spent communicating with our customers about their options for remote working services, would you believe it? And we had a fair few instances where people were looking to use the effectively free at point of use Microsoft Direct Access or other Microsoft VPN products that are just there and built into Windows Server. But the sad reality is a lot of these products, although free in nature, they actually have costs elsewhere. In particular, these services typically don't allow the notion of least privilege, making it so that your users who should not have access to remote desktop services, or perhaps those users who shouldn't have access to SSH consoles or other web management consoles, can actually be restricted through those tools. So here on the right-hand side, we have a very simple rule written into a Palo Alto Networks appliance, where we're simply stating that any user from the VPN source zone, if they match the VPN user security group, they can only go to the trusted network. And in particular, they can only reach some remote desktop servers that are being published to them. And by taking these rules, we can really refine down the scope of any threat actor that might make it inside your network. So if they only compromise a low privilege account, it's much harder for those threat actors to then go and breach out into other parts of your network and look for other systems that they might be able to exploit at a higher privilege level. This also gives us the option to log and take action on any attempts to move outside of the permitted destinations. So if we see a known low privileged user attempting to repeatedly access and perhaps have a failed password attempt against a high privileged system, this can be a brilliant indicator of compromise, perhaps suggesting that that user account has been compromised in some manner. This, of course, makes it very easy to cut off the threat actors at the persistence and command and control level. If they can't breach out to the internet from these systems, if they can't breach to trusted IT services or servers, they just can't continue with their malicious activities. And this all brings us very quite nicely into the next 3 questions, which revolve around the notion of logging and using that logging to provide useful insights. So question number 7, are you logging authentication into your services? Now, for the longest time, we were seeing the firewall as being the main perimeter protection against our services, protecting them from the internet. But the reality now is that identity, especially as we start to adopt more and more SaaS services, is becoming that main perimeter protection. And by logging those attempted uses of identity, we can look for some interesting insights, in particular, perhaps those users who have been seen trying to log in from a known malicious IP address, perhaps a Tor exit node, for instance, again, something that can be quite easily blocked at that very first reconnaissance phase using some simple firewall rules. Or perhaps those users that have been seen in one country and a couple of minutes later are then seen in another country. So these atypical travel or impossible travel scenarios. Now, a lot of identity providers these days, such as Microsoft Azure Active Directory, as you can see at the top there, have these tools built in at even the free tiers now. And you can use these to inform your security decisions. If you see a single user account receiving a large number of attempted logins from weird geographies, if you can't block those weird geographies, perhaps you can consult with that user and see if there's perhaps a way that we can bring them up to a higher standard of MFA, looking at using those hardware keys perhaps to provide additional security around their accounts. And in addition, you can even use simple logging services to go and identify those users who are perhaps logging in outside of normal working hours. And perhaps this can be linked back to those users who are perhaps a bit of a flight risk. So those users who might be trying to act as an insider threat and potentially steal information from inside the organization. Now, the problem, of course, with logging is you might feel like you're getting stuck inside the matrix, as we can see there. But just by focusing on one element of logging, for instance, logging authentication, we can really start to get some very good value immediately, instead of having to look at a very broad spectrum of logging. So continuing on with the same theme, and of course, starting out with authentication, but then moving it on to data and access to data. So if an account was compromised, could you identify what data was accessed? Now, if you haven't already got it deployed, I would really recommend you go and have a look at Microsoft's free Sysmon tool, which effectively generates very human readable event logs. And these event logs can be anything from command line usage, file server access, network traffic analysis, or even looking at logging DNS requests and outputting them, as you can see there on the right-hand side, into a very human readable format. So we can see here in this instance that the user spun up the DNS lookup tool and they were looking to reach out to roguedomain.com. And if you've ever, of course, looked at the Windows event logs in the past, there's a lot of information there, but it's very hard to read. The Sysmon tool and the various profiles that you can use through it really make some nice, clear, very simple and easy to read event logs. Now, equally so, these logs can be used in partnership perhaps with a centralized logging service to detect weird usage of data. So has an abnormally large number of read or write or even delete requests suddenly been seen on a file server? And this can help us detect any elements of data exfiltration. Now, when it does come to centralized logging services, we've got a very strong and rich history now, actually, with a free and open source piece of software called Greylog, which can act as a very simple aggregator, absorb log information from a variety of systems, not just your traditional syslog services, but also from Windows machines as well, and output and parse them into a very human readable format as well. So question number 9. What are your next steps when an account is compromised? Is there a plan written down? So we've had a logging event fire off, there's been an alert generated. Do we actually have a plan in the event that X has happened? So if a user account has been phished, if we know that we've got a password compromise, do we have a written down plan that states how we're going to reset that password, how we're going to communicate with the user to ensure that they get back online and back working as soon as possible? And equally so, do we have a plan on where we're going to go to see if there was any truly malicious activity against this account? This also brings us quite nicely into, if you do see malicious activity on a particular computer, do you have a method to one-click button push and isolate that machine from the network, cut off its access to the internet, cut off the potential for the threat actors to not just establish persistence, but also start to establish command and control upon that machine? And equally so, if things have gone really wrong, if you are in a situation where you just can't handle it yourself, do you have someone who you can call upon to perhaps investigate what's actually happened, someone who can explain the log information to you and identify what the threat actors were up to? Now, quite recent and perhaps new to me as well is the National Cybersecurity Centre actually have a form on their website now where you can go and report a cybersecurity incident to them. And they're encouraging all organisations to do this, not just government organisations. And for those of you who might be eligible to receive assistance from the National Cybersecurity Centre, there's also a little drop-down box inside that form as well where you can go and ask them to get back in touch and provide any assistance that they're capable or willing to in those instances to you as well. And this helps them build up their own knowledge base and repository of the threats that are being seen, and perhaps also deliver measures on a national scale that can be used to stop similar attacks in the future. So our final question, question number 10, have you had an external audit of your remote services after these remote services have been deployed in order to provide some measure of peace of mind to you? And equally so for any services which have already been deployed, have you had some form of penetration test, some kind of audit against those services within the last 12 months? So this really does bring us to the notion of penetration testing. And it's very important these days that instead of just saying, here's the web service, see if you can break in, that we actually communicate with our penetration test partners and tailor the threats and services that are actually going to be under attack there for our penetration test. So if it's a measure of you've got really strong identity protections, now is actually the time to invite your penetration test partner into the network, provide them with valid credentials, and see what their options are for lateral movement. See if your protections that you've put in place for network level blocks and such like are indeed working, that the threat actors perhaps can't compromise a domain controller when they should only be able to access file servers, for instance. And of course, once you do receive that report, and that report should at a bare minimum include how the threat can actually be exploited and some recommended first actions for mitigation, it's important that you actually review those, that you apply those additional security measures where appropriate, and that you then invite the penetration test partner back in to see that those measures are indeed actually working. And by having these penetration tests, we can really look to block the threat actors at every measure. And we want to start on the left-hand side. From the outside of your network, can your penetration test partner identify vulnerable services? Can they conduct that reconnaissance? Is there an easy way for them to upload files into your network? Is there an easy way for them to do command and control from inside your network already? Invite them in and allow them to conduct these extensive tests so that they can really assure that you have really applied this cycle of continuous improvement. So we've covered 10 different measures there, and it's important to remember that we only need to win once to block the threat actors. So if we can cut off those threat actors who are casual and only operating in a particular country by using geographic block rules, absolutely fantastic. We've made a very quick and easy win there. But after that, the more determined threat actors need to be those who can actively phish users or make it through strong identity protections. And if we can apply those MFA policies, if we can use security certificates to restrict access to our networks, we've really got to go to a very sophisticated level of attacker now who can not only breach your network, but remain undetected. And if we do have strong methods for detection inside the network, we truly have now restricted that scope of the threat actors down to just those who are capable of exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities, new tools and techniques that have just never been seen before. So when it actually comes round to what my options are, it's going to depend on the services that you've got published out there to the internet. So at the very beginning of the March lockdown and such like, we saw a fair few organizations opening up web services that were previously only restricted to their corporate LAN out to the internet. And in these cases, now's the time to have a good vulnerability scan against those web services, see if there's any low-hanging fruit as far as unpatched versions of Apache go, or unpatched versions of IIS perhaps out there, to go and immediately identify those. Now, one of the brilliant things that we do with ANSecurity actually is offer free ad hoc vulnerability scans to all organizations that we're working with. So if you would like one of these vulnerability scans, just get in touch with your ANSecurity account manager and they can help you through that process. Now, whilst that vulnerability scan is going, it's also time to communicate with whoever is running your network operations center or your SOC, or whoever just happens to be receiving the email alerts, and seeing, did they actually pick up that scan? Do you have the detection methods to show that someone is probing the edges of your network? And for those who are publishing services out to the internet, it's also time to have a look at decrypting that traffic before it reaches your actual servers, your actual web servers. And you can do this by providing the private key of that website up to your firewalls, or perhaps even looking at a dedicated web application firewall, which is designed to block specific threats relating to web browsing traffic. Now, when it comes to those organizations which are using traditional VPNs, now's the time to have a bit of a consideration of, are most of your services still on premise? we're seeing a lot of organizations pushing towards SaaS services. And by tunneling traffic all the way back to your corporate VPN appliance and then pushing them back out to the internet, you can introduce some delays and latencies there. And we'll actually discuss some mitigations for that in the next slide. But also, if you have published any of these services out to the internet, any policies which you've written, any security rules which state that only specific users can reach specific servers, do they actually apply to the users on your VPN as well? And if you haven't done so already, have you invited those penetration testers inside your network to see what the scope of the damage is that they could do if they were acting in a malicious nature? And I cannot reinforce this enough. There are still a lot of Pulse VPN appliances out there, in particular with agencies over in the United States reporting a great many tens of thousands, even in some instances, where organizations just haven't patched their VPN. It is very important that you keep on top of that patching cycle. And if you haven't patched your appliance, perhaps within the last 2 or 3 months, you've probably missed some patches. Make sure you reach out to your software providers, your hardware providers there to ensure that you are indeed receiving the latest updates. I mentioned earlier that a lot of appliances on their first initial deployment will have a very open and a very permissive security policy. Have a consideration about, is now the time for a configuration health check? If that VPN appliance was deployed perhaps 5 or 6 years ago and hasn't been examined recently, there's definitely going to be some scope there to get some additional value to ensure that any traffic going towards your VPN is indeed appropriately protected. Now, for those organizations that are operating as mostly SaaS-based, so if you're using Office 365, Microsoft 365, perhaps Google Computer, AWS services, now is the time to perhaps consider a SASE service or a secure access service edge. The idea being that if most of your services are delivered as SaaS, why not deliver your VPN as SaaS? And even organizations with the size and scale of Cisco at the beginning of the lockdown were actually having bandwidth problems. We're having to resort to split tunneling, whereby traffic that was destined for the corporate network went through the VPN, whereas traffic that went to the internet just went out straight to the internet from the user's machines. And suddenly all those protections that we might have around URL filtering or malicious file analysis have completely gone out the window with those machines just reaching straight out to the internet. Now, these new SASE services are all designed about cutting down that latency between those users and those SaaS services. So perhaps if you're using predominantly Microsoft 365 services, that your SASE service would be deployed into Azure. And the same if you're deploying into Google services, you would have your SASE service delivered into GCP. Now, a couple of other instances to cover here. So in some instances, a lot of organizations have rushed to buy out whatever machines that they could and kick them out to the users. I've even seen a couple of instances where users were asked to pick up their desktop and their monitor and drag those back home to use from home. But as some organizations do bring users back home, or perhaps as some users refer or prefer to actually be back inside the office, now is the time to consider these machines that we're bringing back. Do we have an inventory of them? Do we know what state those machines are in? Do they have drive encryption enabled on them? Do they have the latest Windows updates on them? And are there services that we can use that when those machines do indeed connect back up to the internal network to actually analyze those? Can we identify those machines that do need drive encryption enabled? Can we identify those machines which are perhaps a couple of months behind on their Windows update? And tools like the Pulse Profiler or even again Nmap can be used to very quickly identify those machines. And finally, universally applying to all organizations, have a plan when it all goes wrong. If you encounter a major breach, a major data loss, perhaps something that might impact your reputation as an organization, have a notion of who you can call to reach out to provide some measure of support. And in some cases, that might just be a sounding board. Is this the right decision? Or in some other cases, of course, it might be a full-on threat response scenario, whereby we're looking to establish a root cause. How did the threat actors make it inside the network? And what can we do to kick them out? So I'm going to leave you there now and hand back to Rich. Thank you all.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, James. Absolutely excellent. Right, if you just hold on 1 second, I will press a few buttons and there we go. Right, so What we promised at the start is we wanted to wrap up with a few takeaways. Times are tight. What can we do that costs us nothing? So that's our key focus, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to rattle through this as quickly as possible. So if you need more information, just let me know. So number one, it's this introspective analysis that James talked about at the start of this section. Go through those 10 questions. Some of them are simply binary yes or no type questions. Others are more about a grading, but it's all about looking inside your organization. It's going to take you probably no more than an hour to do it. And we've done this a number of times over the last couple of weeks. And every single time we've done it, it's been hugely valuable. But you've absolutely got to be honest with yourself when you answer each one of these questions, because it's going to become fairly clear just by going through the process where you need to go and spend your time and where you don't. And rather going into huge detail on this side of things, if you want me to send you over a quick checklist, just drop me a line or reach out to your ANSecurity account manager. So vendors, we mentioned the problems of vendors earlier and that there's a lot of noise. So what we've done, and I suppose the value that we bring here, is we go and cut through a lot of that noise and come to you with things that we think are worthwhile looking at. Vendors are an excellent source of free stuff if you approach it in the right manner. You know, we're talking about things like product evaluations, and this is, of course, what vendors want you to do. But if you go into it with your eyes open and you're clear from the outset as to what your objective is, there's a lot that you can learn to use organizations who are offering services that are going to go and help you. Now, we picked out a couple. The first one that I want to talk about is from Pulse Secure. So, you know, if you are one of the organizations who are worried about devices on your local network having access to network resources beyond what they should do, then, you know, how about looking at a managed trial of something like Pulse Secure Profiler? It's an absolutely fantastic piece of software. And by running a managed trial and being clear what you're trying to achieve, you will get some really good insight as to what's going on within your network. It's a great network access control solution. The next one, are you worried about threat actors compromising a web service that you're publishing to the intranet? You know, maybe, you know, as James mentioned, maybe Web Application Firewall's your thing. And the reason why I'm referring to Barracuda here is Barracuda and I don't think this is something they offer with all partners. I think it's just something we've kind of sort of bullied them into, but we've got a great way of being able to evaluate software and learn a lot in the process for the total lowest risk you could possibly do. And the process at a high level is we go and sit down with you and really understand, by doing a little bit of a workshop, whether there is actually a problem, because in many instances actually there's not a problem that needs to be solved, it's just a little bit of a process change. Now, if it turns out there is a problem, we'll then go and start to look at the business case. Basically, we're trying to answer the question, is this a problem that actually financially is worthwhile solving? Because in many instances it isn't. We may as well not invest time if we don't need to. If it does turn out that there's a problem that needs to be solved, then we can go and look at various different scenarios, so we can go and see solutions of different types working in a real-time environment. It's pretty much the lowest cost way that you can have to evaluating a solution. It's very, very low risk, but the real benefit here is the sorts of things that you learn along the way about your organization. So, cloud. Now, if as an organization you're either committed to the cloud or it's something that you're contemplating moving towards in any way, shape or form, then we'd recommend running a cloud workshop. We do this at ANSecurity. We're actually funded by various different organizations to do this. So one of them being Palo Alto Networks. And these are essentially sessions that are run by somebody like James or one of his colleagues. And they're different every single time because obviously the customer's requirements are entirely different. But what we'll do is we'll look at things like current and future SaaS usage. We might hop into things like security lifecycle reviews, and depending upon what we find and what your challenges are, there's a range of solutions and things that we can run at in order to go and learn more about the organization, but see things actually working in action. And finally, James mentioned it right at the end, you know, you've got to have a plan. You've absolutely got to have a plan for that worst case scenario. So I want to just talk about this organisation called Signet that we've been working with recently. They're fairly new to the UK market. We've been nothing but impressed with them, and there's lots of freebies that we can take advantage of as well. Basically, they offer autonomous breach protection, which basically means that they're the kind of guys that you really need to have on hand if you get breach. So there's a bunch of stuff that we can get for free. The first one is that they offer a pretty unintrusive threat detection service, which you can go and use to assess whether there are any vulnerabilities that have already hit your network. Now, it might sound and feel like that's not much value, but on the basis that an average typical organization doesn't learn about a threat until about 147 days after the time in which they're originally attacked, there is a significant chance that you've already been compromised. And I'd go so far as to say, I put my neck on the line, and we had at peak, I think there was 80 people on this call. I reckon 10% of people are already breached and they are yet to find out about it. But it's not just a free threat assessment that they offer, it's kind of what that tells you. That's where it gets really interesting. So if you have been breached, then we'd work with Signet to go and remediate against the threat, or more preferential, if you've got a clean bill of health, then Signet and ANSecurity would provide a 12-month breach response service, all with zero charge. So, if we look at the cost of a breach that we talked about earlier, plus the likelihood of it happening as a result of the increase in the behavior of the threat actors, I would see this as essentially free insurance for something that is statistically inevitable for most organizations at some point in the future. There's absolutely no catches here. So if this is something that you're interested in understanding a little bit more about, just give me a call, drop me a line, or talk to your ANSecurity account manager. So I've rattled through that as quickly as possible in the spirit of timekeeping, and we did promise that there would be time for questions, and we've actually had 3 that have come through. So James, if it's all right with you, can I just fire a couple over to you? So I'm gonna have to paraphrase here. So for now, we're depending on employees' own hardware for home working. What protections, in addition to the ones that you've mentioned, should we be looking at?
Yeah, so the words "for now" there at the beginning, I hope that means that you are actually rolling out some enterprise grade and properly protected laptops to your users. The real concern and consideration there is not actually knowing what software is on the user's machines at the other end. So you might find that through your VPN appliance or your VPN agents on the machines that you can actually report on that. In particular, when it comes to tools which might be vulnerable to remote access. So those users that might install something like TeamViewer, for instance, on their machines in the past, it might be an easy way for a user to be phished to then get onto that machine and perhaps start to steal corporate data from an untrusted, unsecured machine. The other aspect of it, of course, as well, is the potential for data loss. So again, through most VPN agents these days, you can also check if the machine has got some hardware encryption enabled, be it BitLocker or the Apple equivalents as well. And it's really important to have those enabled. And perhaps if the user doesn't have some method of encryption enabled on their personal device, that those users quite simply don't have access to particularly sensitive corporate resources, or perhaps some other method is used to secure those resources. Perhaps they're not allowed to be downloaded explicitly and only viewed through a website. The reality is, though, get those machines onto kind of corporate machines as soon as you can, of course, so you can actually have some proper controls. Of course, there's a lot of protections these days around mobile devices through modern MDM services, and it's very easy to enable those services. And even through things like Microsoft Intune, you can have an element of MDM on users' own Windows and Mac machines. But yeah, really continue that push. But it sounds like you've already got going there to get those users onto corporately owned devices instead.
Cracking, thanks, James. So I knew this would come up. Is Zoom bombing actually a threat? An annoyance yet, but is it actually a threat?
Yeah, so threat actors actually have a number of different objectives. Sometimes it really is to just steal data. Sometimes it is to encrypt data and demand a Bitcoin ransom, but sometimes it legitimately is there to damage the company's reputation. And if you imagine if you had a Zoom bombing attack against maybe a CEO level meeting, or perhaps a meeting with your financial organization, and you've got a threat actor there who's silently recording it in the background, That's the risk there. You know, the risk is damage to your reputation more than anything else. And it is sometimes just a case of threat actors are going for, you know, easy targets who might go and publish those Zoom URLs with the passphrase and such like out to the internet. Very easy to exploit, very easy perhaps to hold those organizations to some measure of ransom.
Okay, so this is the second time in 24 hours we've been asked this question. What alternatives to patching are there?
Okay, so 100% get patched. There should be very few reasons that an organization has to not go and patch services. And even if it's a matter of not enough time or resource, consider the time or resource that would have to be spent remediating a proper breach inside your organization. But really there, it loops back to a couple of the other previous slides where if you're publishing services out to the internet that are encrypted, so via HTTPS, decrypt that traffic and then use something like a next generation firewall or web application firewall and exploit the vulnerability protections that are going to be built into there. So as organizations like Microsoft, Adobe, Nginx and such like go and publish their patches, they'll also publish a method of how we can go and detect these as well. And companies like Palo Alto Networks and FortiGate and all the other, you know, top tier firewall vendors will actually write routines into their firewalls to go and detect people trying to exploit those vulnerabilities. And you can use that technology to cut off those threat actors. But it's important to understand they're brilliant protections, but at some point, the threat actor is going to be a little bit more ahead of the curve. And that's where having that patching in is always going to be, always should be your top priority. Get those deployed.
Fantastic. So if you've got any further questions, we've run out of time. We've actually run a little bit over. Feel free to email them over to myself, and I promise you will get a response from us. But it just leaves me to say thank you very much for your time this morning. We hope you found the session useful. We're obviously interested in any feedback that you've got because we do want to make sure that these are a valuable use of your time. But enjoy your rest of your day and please keep safe. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.